I just got a PhD in Earth Sciences, and these are the 3 things the Epstein class does not want you to know about climate change. Human-made climate change is not disputed, and just in case nobody ever showed you the data, here it is. So this graph goes from 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct all the way up until today. Although you can see Earth's temperature was hotter in the past and has fluctuated a lot throughout history, it jumps up significantly just in these last 250 years whilst we have been pumping fossil fuels into the atmosphere to fuel industry. What is unprecedented about human-made climate change and why we know it isn't natural isn't about the magnitude of temperature increase. It's about the pace. Temperature changes, which usually take thousands of years, are happening in decades. Biology cannot adapt fast enough because it is constrained by generational cycles, and what happens if a species cannot adapt to its environment and survive and pass on its genes? And yes, we are currently in a mass extinction. One more graph, bear with me. This is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and this is hundreds of thousands of years. Does this look normal and natural to you? But I just showed you 2 graphs, one of temperature and one of CO2. How do we even know these things are related, and when did we find out? Well, that brings me to point number 2. We have known about anthropogenic or human-made global warming since the late 1800s, and the paedophile billionaires, the Epstein class, who owned the fossil fuel companies, paid to cover it up. There was 70 years lead up to this, but in 1896, a Swedish chemist proved that burning fossil fuels would increase the temperature of the Earth by increasing CO2, and then everyone promptly forgot about it until the 1950s. When Charles David Keeling, working at Caltech, began taking readings of the CO2 and temperature and created something called the Keeling curve, which showed a clear year-on-year increase and finally experimentally verified the theory. But his research was funded by, you guessed it, the fossil fuel industry. And this remained the trend for the following 30 years, where studying the effects of the fossil fuel industry was primarily the domain of the fossil fuel industry. As you can imagine, the research was not widely reported, but that was up until the 1979 Carney Report and a bit later the 1988 first edition of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The cat was now out of the bag, but the fossil fuel cabal did not back down. Instead, they mounted their offensive, forming PR agencies, think tanks, lobby groups, all with one goal: to undermine and cast doubt on climate science and ensure that no regulation on emissions or climate targets could be pushed through, which would in any way affect their profit margins. These groups were responsible for the largest polluter on Earth, the US, not ratifying the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, holding back our collective efforts for a sustainable future for us all for another decade until 2015 and the Paris Agreement, which was signed by 197 countries on Earth, and then Trump pulled out 2 years later, which was then later reversed under Biden, but it really set the tone for the rest of his presidencies. We've reached the point where the petrochemical Epstein class don't even need to hide what they're doing anymore. Trump can literally invade another country and just flat out say, I'm doing this for oil. Trump has also been gutting environmental protection legislation, but Trump is just one actor and this is systemic. Which brings me to point number 3. The climate crisis at its current state is intentional and is being propagated by and profited from by the Epstein class. This is not a fringe idea. There have been many peer-reviewed articles over the last 20 years which have brought attention to the fact that billionaires and a sustainable planet are not compatible. The Epstein class, or the top 1% of wealth hoarders on Earth, contribute disproportionately to climate change in 3 main ways: consumption emissions, investment emissions, and political influence. But we all know that private jets and yachts pump out CO2, so let's look at something which is a little bit less talked about: investment emissions. As you can see, the top 1%, that's a few thousand people, contribute over 70% of the total emissions from their investments. Compare that to the bottom 50% of humanity, that is 4 billion people, who contribute a measly 6%. But they're not just profiting from polluting via their investment portfolios. They're profiting from the actual crisis itself. Epstein said to Thiel in an email that finding things on the way to collapse is much easier than finding the next bargain. And remember, these aren't your everyday investor. They control more capital than entire nations and move wealth and insider knowledge with the most pervasive intelligence agencies and institutions on Earth. The Epstein class want us confused and scared, but most importantly divided. So we spend time pointing fingers at each other rather than them. At the small scale, this can be anti-immigration sentiment, conveniently ignoring the rising numbers of climate refugees, but it escalates into war, which is another way the Epstein class profit from destruction of the climate and everything else. The US war machine, or military-industrial complex, is the largest oil guzzler on the planet. And just the bombs dropped on Gaza over the last 2 years amounts to the annual emissions of over 100 countries. Ultimately, the same people who profit from the war machine are the same people profiting from the petrochemical industry, are the same people who are profiting from the destruction of our planet. But it's not all doom and gloom. We now have a name and a target, and outnumber them by the billions. We are in an information war for our survival, and you are fighting as you watch this video, so like, share, and engage. This is a call to action, and our weapons are boycott, divestment, and sanction, so we can hit them where it hurts, in the wallet.